Assalamu alaikum, dear students. Today in this lecture, I'll focus on broadcast and web news writing. In our last class, we talked about letter writing, letters to editors, and we talked about, what are the four very important aspects. Its purpose, prompts, then tone and format, and of course we discussed these things in detail. Today, of course, we'll be talking about this news writing thing. Of course, we've already talked about what is news and what are P's and Q's of news writing. But this one that was actually for, you call it paper news writing, or you can say news writing for newspapers. But this one is slightly different. Of course, this is news writing for TV, news writing for radio, news writing for web. Of course, when we say news writing for different medium, for example TV, let's say, or radio or web, keep very fundamental thing in your mind that the change of medium does not affect the newsworthiness or the concept of news or the definition of news. Of course, news is news, something which is new, something which is important for people, directly or indirectly, something which people want to talk about, know about, and would like to react upon, would be affected and influenced by all that, the fundamental concepts of news are very much the concepts of news in TV, radio and web also. This you have to keep in mind, and it's only the change of medium. Of course, when you change the medium, there are certain fundamentals which will be changed, and there will be some do's and don'ts you'll have to keep in mind. Well, very frankly, it's the change of the mode actually, fundamentally. Like when you say TV news, for example, what you do actually, you do not read news on TV. Radio news, you do not read news on radio. You listen actually, you hear actually. There is somebody who is reading for you and you are hearing it. Whereas in newspapers, someone has written something for you and you read and you understand. Well, that's what actually we call mode. If you remember, like we once talked about register. Register, asks three questions. Of course, mode, manner and field. When we say mode, mode means, the difference between, of course, the medium. Are you going to write things or you're going to speak things? Oral and written mode. And there's a huge difference, between oral and written thing. In newspapers, news is written, whereas in TV and radio, news is not written actually. News is read. News is spoken out, So that's the difference. Let's first try to understand the difference between, oral and written, modes. Look here, broadcast news, of course, you will have some speakers, which we call as newscasters, they are there. Report is exactly the same way written in broadcast, in TV and radio also, the way it is written in newspapers. There are some news reporters, they go into the field, they collect information, they put that information down and in the format of a news, and then of course that piece of news goes to the bed. There it's printed, and newspaper in very physical material form reaches your hands, and of course you read them. Whereas in here in TV and radio, same way, there are reporters, they of course go to the field, collect news, they write news for you. Of course, the same way, most important thing first, and second most important third, and third most important third. So this is all they compose news for you. But now news does not go into press for printing, rather it goes, of course, to an announcer or newscaster, who is sitting there, he or she or he, reads out that news for you, and of course you listen to. Of course, like the way when we compare like, written and oral mode, written thing is, of course, very much in your hand. You can read it, you can reread it. If something is, confusing, you can third time read it. I mean, that like because that's a permanent thing, in your hand, see? Whereas TV thing, for 1 or 2 minutes, there will be a news bulletin, and they are going to like, give you headlines. If you, understood, fine, but you cannot play them again, you'll have to wait for, let's say, next 30 minutes, or you wait for another like, an hour to read, again, to listen to again the same news and then understand. Or sometimes what happens, people switch over. I mean, they read some, let's say, news on, they listen, they hear some news, of course, on TV and radio. For the details, like, they refer to the newspapers. Of course, newspapers have more space to give you the details and the depths. TV and radio, they do not have, this much space in terms of time, actually, to discuss, longer, of course, pieces of information. They, of course, focus on the headlines and then, the précis thing of the event or the incident, of course, they discuss with you. So, let's discuss the first difference. Of course, in newspaper news writing, we use words, whereas in TV and radio, we use voices and bodies. Voices means, newscaster is going to use, this, what you call, this rhythm, this pitch also, see, the stress also, and the bodies like gestures, facial expressions, eye contact. These things are, very much in the TV and the radio. Then in newspaper, the paper news, actually, we punctuate, whereas in TV and radio, there is no punctuation, because report is read, actually, read out, for you. It's in the form of voice, actually. It's not in the form of word. So there is no punctuation, actually. What is there then? There is pause, like when we put comma. Comma means, pause, for example. Full stop is a very long pause, So exactly the same way, newscasters, they give pauses and they intonate their voices. The rise and fall of their voices. For example, when they end a sentence, they will show a falling, what you say, the voice is going to fall, okay? And when they are going to, let's say, read out some listings, for example, like two, three items, names when they're going to talk about, of course, they'll rise their, their tone will go up, and then full stop, they will fall down. So, pause and intonation thing is very much common, whereas in, paper news, you have some punctuation you have to follow. Now, just imagine, the importance of this pause and intonation. If from a paragraph, if you remove all punctuation marks, remove all commas and semicolons and colons and dashes and brackets and everything, if you remove, what is left then? Nothing is left, actually. Confusion is left. Nobody will be able to make head or tail of it. Exactly the same way, when newscaster, removes or ignores pause and intonation, what will be left? Nothing. People will, of course, will be confused. Of course, these are similar things, One is for writing, effect is same, their concept is same, their purpose is same. So this is the third one is, of course, spellings are very important. Like people, when you write, news, in proofreading, the most important thing, which we proofread, is what? Spellings, actually. Just imagine a piece of news full of spelling errors. What a bad impression. What a bad impression. Every word spelled out wrong. Exactly the same way. You do not have spellings in TV and radio because it's voice. So voice has pronunciation. I'll give special today focus on pronunciation of the newscasters also. Pronunciation, over the spellings, and here pronunciation. Now, the way I say, like, it's very important for the paper news to have all spellings correct exactly the same way. It's important for the newscasters of radio or TV to have correct pronunciation. Whatever name, whatever word they are speaking, it has to be properly, pronounced, correctly pronounced technically. Otherwise, of course, problem. The way spellings mistakes, exactly the same way, pronunciation errors are taken, the way spelling errors are taken. Next comes, compact and formal. Paper news is very compact, very formal, whereas this TV news or radio news is more conversational. When I say conversational, it means that, of course, like newscaster is in a way, talking to you, speaking with you, okay, telling you something. So it's more conversational, right? Writing is sort of a passive thing. Someone has written. Who has written? You don't know. It's for you. No, those words, those sentences, those paragraphs are for you. Okay, you read, whereas here you have eye contact. Here you have a link, that someone is a speaker, you are a listener. So that link is there. So you two are in a conversation, at the same time. So you can see your speaker also, whereas you cannot see your writer, In newspaper reports, you can see your writer, whereas in TV and radio, you can see, especially in TV. Of course, in radio you can see, but in TV, of course, you can see, your, what you call, your speaker. When I say you can see your radio, indirectly, this is another interesting thing. These radio, newscasters, they are actually taught a skill to narrate and describe things in such a way that they paint pictures. That they paint pictures before you, as if like, you are very much present, or they are very much, which we call as the art of storytelling. So with that respect, actually, I said, you can see actually your radio. Of course, not the way like, you can of course see your, newscasters, on TV. Next one is in paper news writing, of course, we use more complex structures, complex sentences. Why we use complex sentences? Of course, for high impact. And with this conception that, well, paper is a physical thing in reader's hand. If any sentence they can understand, they can reread it. Whereas in TV and radio news reports, we rely more on simple sentences. Why? Because these simple sentences, these sentences are not going to be read actually by, they're going to be heard by the people. Therefore, do not, construct such sentences, which are this much long that people lose the logical, link between, ideas in that very long sentence. So we go for the smaller sentences. Another important thing is, this paper news writing requires or demands long attention span. I mean, sometimes you can, like in the case of opinion writing, you can go for longer paragraphs also, you can go for longer sentences also. So, especially in formal newspapers, like in, what you call broad, sheet newspapers, sometimes paragraphs are very long. I mean, the whole paragraph is composed of only one single sentence. Therefore, long attention span is required from the readers, whereas in TV, radio, news writing, special care is given to this thing that, attention span require or expect a very short attention span, from the listeners, so that, your news is reported through small sentences and through small attention spans. So this is how, you see the difference actually between the mode difference of, this newspaper, news writing, and TV and radio's, news writing. Now, let's discuss some important principles, which are the principles of TV and radio, first of all. Web I'll discuss, later on. TV and radio. Keep in your mind now, in TV and radio, news will be on air. News will not be on a piece of paper. News will be on air. So, keeping this one in mind, we can read out some very important principles of this news writing for TV and radio. The very first principle, since your news is going to be read out Your news is, someone is going to speak that news, someone is going to voice that news for some listener. Therefore, the style of that newscaster, whether it's on TV or on radio, the style of that newscaster should be conversational. I mean, when we say conversational, very formal style, which is not conversational, is of little more passive actually. Newscaster style is going to be very active. You're not going to bore your listeners actually. There should be life in your voice, okay? And you tell the news the way you tell news to your, brothers and sisters, to your mom and dad, with all that enthusiasm. But of course, this enthusiasm actually means, there should be life, a spark in your voice. So have your style conversational, first of all. And when we say conversational, of course, this is on the part of the newscaster. But there is a person who we call news reporter, who is sitting behind, behind this newscaster. This is his job as well, his duty also, that he writes news, conversationally. I mean, he uses words which are not, you can say, hard words actually. Hard words means, they should not be 3 or more than 3 syllabic long words, okay? So have short and conversational words so that, when newscaster reads out that news, feels it easy to pronounce and enunciate, those words. And of course, it's that news reporter's job for the newscaster to offer sentences, which are not extremely formal the way we have for the writing, rather less formal. I'm not saying informal, but I'm saying, less formal, smaller in size, okay, mouthful, easily, spoken constructions, and keep in mind the same universal news writing structure, subject, verb, and object, and that's it, and full stop. Then again, subject, verb, and object, and full stop. Smaller sentences so that, newscaster could easily read them out. And listener could easily, understand that piece of news. So this is principle number 1, be conversational in your approach. News writer also of TV and radio, newscaster obviously will be, Principle number 2, write concisely. As I told you before, that here, news is not going to be on a piece of paper, it's going to be on air. So brevity is going to be the real jewel of news writing. As, we always talk about, there are 3 ABCs of, news writing. One is accuracy, brevity, and clarity. I'll change its order. I'll say number 1 is, this, what you call brevity is number 1. You should be extremely brief, in, dressing up your ideas, in the selection of your words. Don't go for the wordy expressions. Don't go for the redundancies, actually. Don't go for unnecessarily repetitions, for example. Don't go for, what you call splitters, for example. Don't go for phrasals, for example. Go for one-word substitution, so that you could minimize the number of words in your sentence, and economy of expression, you could introduce to your news, so that your news in very less number of words, in very less number of sentences, could be conveyed effectively and meaningfully to your listeners. This is very, very important thing. If you ask me, out of accuracy, brevity, and this clarity, which one is the most important? As I told you before, the most important, accuracy, no one disagrees with. Things have to be, news is what, of course, which is accurate, of course. Out of clarity and brevity, for TV news and radio, number 1, it should be brief. And then number 2, of course, it should be clear also. Number 3, important principle for TV and news, that is, if there are any complicated ideas, you are going to simplify them. Simplify means, rewrite your sentences, okay? Because it will be very difficult for your reader to understand complicated, ideas when they are only getting your news on air. It will be difficult. Why? Because ideas after ideas are gonna storm his ears actually. See, that's the difference of the medium, you know, that in the written mode actually, you have an option, you know, rereading option. You can reread. You can go into third and the fourth and the fifth reading. Doesn't matter. Whereas here, only one time. Newscaster is not going to repeat the news. One idea and again gonna repeat. No, it doesn't happen, you know. You'll have to wait for the next bulletin to understand that complicated idea. Therefore, strong advice is that if there is any complicated idea you want to discuss, make sure it is expressed through very simple and through very easy to understand words. If there are any jargons used, try to replace those jargons with easy to understand words. If there are any technical phraseology, try to introduce simple, everyday, conversational translations to those words so that people could feel it easy in understanding that complex idea which you are trying to convey. Fourth important principle, that is research and verify all information. The way we say, like writer's ink actually, once the word comes out from writer's ink, there are, you know, correction pens available. You can, of course, use those correction pens and you can, you know, correct those wrong words or wrong ideas. But frankly speaking, we do not have any correction word, any correction pen actually, or any, you know, correcting tool actually for the TV and the, you know, this radio, you know, news writing. Once it's out of your mouth, it's out. It's like an arrow. Once it's out, once you've left the arrow in air, it's gone. You cannot get it back. Exactly the same way, make sure that before your news reaches the newscaster, the news reporter's job is that revise, proofread, edit that news as many times as possible, reverse read it, counter check it, ask third person to read that, and verify all the facts and figures which you are using, all the names which you have used, spellings, pronunciation especially, that should be correct. And then, you know, one-on-one guide that newscaster, that, you know, how she's going to pronounce those names, how she's going to, you know, read out the listings, for example, and all that, so that, you know, information which goes out from you as news reporter, from your hand, reaches the newscaster, from his or her mouth, reaches correctly to the listeners, you know, sitting out there listening to you. So these four are very important, I would say, principles for the broadcast news writing. The first one, your approach should be conversational, number one. Number two, you are going to be very much brief, very much to the point. Number three, if there are any complicated ideas, you are going to simplify them, even if you have to rewrite those sentences or rephrase those sentences or recast those sentences or replace technical words and jargons with some simpler stuff, you are going to. And the last one is, when you are like collecting information for your news, of course you're going to conduct a good research and you're going to verify your information, that information from your TV or from your radio channel reaches the people, you know, in all best form. Because credibility and goodwill, frankly speaking, once hurt, ages to build again. Therefore, take care of that. Let's move ahead now. Now, next principle is one very, very important and very practical point, and I'd like to illustrate this point with the help of some examples. This point is, you know, again, the mode difference. There's a huge difference, you know, oral and written mode actually. Exactly the same way when you're writing a news, you know, for TV and radio, avoid newspaper constructions in your writing. Of course, TV and radio, in TV and radio news, there is no any main page, no editorial page, there is no inside page, there is no word supplement, there is no word magazine, right? There is no opposite editorial, there is no editorial page. Things are altogether different, okay? So exactly the same way, you know, there are like certain newspaper constructions which some novice news writers, you know, they let them go and of course then face embarrassment. So make sure that newspaper language, I mean to say newspaper technicalities do not make their appearance, you know, in the TV and radio technicalities. They are totally different from each other. For example, let's take a look on this slide. Don't use terms like in the headlines, front page news, or cover story. Of course, you're not going to use these. These terms are very much, you know, newspaper terms. Next one, newspaper words. Now, there are certain newspaper words, you know, which are very much specific to newspapers. They are not for TV and radio. Let's see what are those. Why, nab, bust, laud, grill, foe, woe, fray, hike. All these words, when they represent raise or increase. So in newspapers, you know, these words go to show raise or increase, and in the TV and radio, of course, we'll be using the formal words raise and increase. If you remember, when we were talking about journalistic, you know, journalistic specialist language, you know, language of the journalists or language of the newspapers, you know, there we talked about the language of the headlines especially. Now, those words, you know, which were very much typical of, like, you know, newspaper appearance only, and then I was giving you the, you know, let's say simple day-to-day translations. So in TV and radio, we're not going to use those actually newspaper words. We'll be using the translations, you know, which I showed you through some slides. So make sure, and you do read actually those stuff again and see, like, you know, can we use that newspaper language for TV and radio news writing, you know, which is to be newscasted? Of course not. Another one, like, don't use ink for signs, don't use pact or opt or I for watch. I mean, in newspaper, you can, of course, write the word I for watch, whereas that's in newscasting, in TV and radio, we'll be using, of course, watch as watch, not I for that. Then blast, rap, and hit for criticize. Don't use it. Then slay, slew, or slain for youth, young person, you know, don't do that. Former, later, you know, or respectively. These words, of course, you cannot use. Respectively is a word for written language, actually. Former and later is a word of written language. You'll be using different, you know, expressions for your TV and news, because it's going to be actually read, going to be, you know, spoken out. Then accord for contract or agreement, and then, you know, prefabricated phrases. For example, it's official, it shouldn't come as a surprise, it had to happen eventually. These prefabricated, you know, expressions, of course, we are not going to use in our TV and, you know, this radio newscasting. Now, our next principle is, do not scare the viewers or listeners. Don't scare your viewers or listeners. Now, when you scare, of course, you scare, of course, you are like, you know, voicing that news. Chances are that your tone becomes subjective, not objective. For example, if you say, this story is very complicated and confusing, now this kind of language is, of course, going to scare your, like, you know, listeners or viewers. Don't use such expressions. You're going to report objectively, okay? You are nobody. You are just a medium, actually. You are only using your voice, actually. So therefore, you know, report as it is should go to the readers, as if, like, you know, they were themselves, you know, watching that happening, actually. Therefore, don't scare them. Another example, the gruesome and horrible details of the gruesome and horrible, actually. This is your listeners' and viewers' job to interpret that piece of news, whether it's gruesome or horrible or not. This is not your job, actually. I mean, newspaper as a page does not speak, you know. That's a page is a dead thing. Language is a living thing. Exactly the same way here, that I would go to this extreme, that newscaster, for example. That's a dead thing, because that's just a medium, actually. Right? That's just a voice. We are making use of that voice, actually. And news should go the way it has been, very objectively written by the reporter and reached out to the readers through the voice of that newscaster. Therefore, newscaster should not contaminate that news by adding some subjectivities, in that. Therefore, don't scare, your viewers or your readers by adding some subjective elements by yourself. I mean, sometimes not experienced, actually, not professional newscasters, of course, they are very much trained and they are very much experienced how to keep themselves, neutral, how to keep themselves out from that, how to keep themselves not a party in that, story. So they, of course, can keep their voice very neutral, frankly speaking, sometimes very flattish in a way. But some, novice newscasters, for example, they, involve some intonation, some unnecessary intonation, in their voicing that news, that objectivity of that story is heard. We look as if, that person is moved by that story, whereas your listeners and viewers are going to be moved. You, as a reader of that news, is not going to be moved, actually, because you are nobody in that. You are only using your voice. You're only using your appearance. So don't come and act as a wall between your news reporter and his news and your listeners and viewers. So keep this one in mind. Then comes, do not give orders. I mean, of course, like, when you are speaking, you are, reading news. So don't, like, for example, the way we say sometimes, like, attention please, can I have your attention please? Or listen me carefully, or be attentive. Newscasters, of course, so don't use such language by mistake, that since it's going to be read out, actually, so newscaster, no, of course not. No way. Next one, do not bury a strong verb in a noun. Do not bury a strong verb in a noun. Of course, many a time I have discussed in this course that you are going to give primary importance to verb in your sentence. Why? Because verb is the name of action. And of course, we are talking about actions. We are not talking about the secondary elements, of that very action, okay? So, when we say a sentence, sentence actually is the name of actor and action and, nothing else, okay? So, make sure actor is its own place, action is its own place. If you have to decide between verbish use or nounish use, preference is going to be on to the verbish. Why? Verbs advance your actions, okay? And nouns or respective modifiers, for example, adjectives, they frankly speaking slow down the action, Therefore, verbs are to be there and to be preferred, of course. Example, if you have to choose between these two, the bomb exploded or the bomb explosion. Of course, don't bury a strong verb in a noun. Therefore, of course, you'll have to, choose the one which is verb-based. One, don't start a story with. Now, I have enlisted some points for you. Let's read them out. Don't start a story with as expected or surprisingly or in an interesting move or a new development. These expected, surprisingly, interestingly, or the new developments, again, I have already, talked these elements about that this is, news is interesting or not. Of course, you have your own criteria. You have your news reporter has his yardstick, actually. He knows what is newsworthy, what incident, what event, what happening can be called a news. He's a technical person. He knows that. He has got a yardstick. He is going to measure, the worth of that incident onto that yardstick, going to decide whether it's a news or not. Once that happening or incident has qualified, to be called a news, it is a news. Now, above this, news is interesting, news is depressing, news is like, involving, grabbing, blah, blah, blah. This is not, that newscaster's job, or this is also not the news reporter's job, to add such elements to. This is only readers, actually. If they find interest, fine. If they find excitement, fine. If they find any entertainment, fine. If they find any educational point in that news, fine. Your job is to convey that piece of news very objectively, and that's it. The next point is, next point of TV and radio, news writing principle, that is, do not characterize the news as good, bad, interesting, or shocking. Again, the same point which I have elaborated. Let's move towards the next one. Next one is, do not start a lead sentence with the participle phrase ing word, a dependent clause, a quotation, or question. Let's start from question, for example. Your listeners, they are there not to listen to questions, actually. They are there to listen to answers. Therefore, provide as many answers as you can. Don't create questions out of your news. Look, that's a persuasive technique. And news writing has got nothing to do with the persuasive stuff, Like in persuasive writing, we use rhetorical devices. We use rhetorical questions to involve our audience, to involve our readers. Whereas in news writing or news, let's say, delivering or speaking, we're not going to use, any persuasive. Yes, you may battle with me, that, excuse me, lead is persuasive. Persuasive means, of course, lead should have only this much persuasive element in it, that it is written in such a form that it can force, its reader to stop over and read. Only this much. But there are no rhetorical devices actually in that news. I'm talking about rhetorical devices. There are no more. Okay? Therefore, don't ask questions just to grab their attention, just to involve them. No, give answers. Number two, do not start your sentences from quotations. When you start your sentences from quotations, what happens? Your words and let's say, quotations words will be mixed up, and your listener or your viewer will be confused, actually, that which words are of yours and which words are of the person you are quoting. Number two. Number three, don't start your sentences from dependent clauses, like the one example I have written for you. Take a look. Needing new shoes, I'll buy a new pair tomorrow. Needing new shoes, this is ing, present participle, ing starting, avoid such. Simply say, I bought new shoes. Very simple thing. Just to tell you the structure, actually. Let's move ahead now. Number 12. Do not start a story with there is, there are, or it is. Now, why we should not? Look, there are two types of verbs, actually. Action verbs and condition verbs. Action verbs, they describe actions, okay? Actions of course, actors. And, of course, we are interested in actions, listening to, reading about actions only. What? Who did what? When he did? Where he did? And then onwards question, how and why and all that stuff. We are interested in, actions. We are not interested in states or conditions. The verbs which I have enlisted, like don't start your sentence from there is, or there are, or it is. This is MR. These are condition verbs. They are not action verbs. These is MR describe no action but condition. When I say he is teaching English, or if I say he is a teacher. So is teaching, for example, is someone's action, whereas he is a teacher is not someone's action. Actually, teacher is not someone's action. Teacher is what? Teacher is his condition, his state, actually. So don't use condition verbs. Why? Because they do not describe actions, number one. Number two, all the sense verbs, like to, let's say, to see, to smell, to taste, to hear, to touch, all these, 5 sense verbs, they are also, condition verbs. Avoid them. And then, words like these has been and have been and will be and shall be, these are also condition verbs. Avoid them. Use action verbs, which could describe actions. This is what actually I meant in here. The next principle is, do not start a lead sentence with the name of an unknown or unfamiliar person. Use title before name. Well, it's obvious, of course, that we are not going to start sentences with such people's names, who we don't know, And another important thing is, if you're using someone's name, then try to start it from, that person's, let's say, title. For example, Seattle newspapers, photographer, so-and-so. So-and-so newspapers, photographer, reporter, columnist, so-and-so. So that before that person's name, you should write what's his title actually. He belongs to so-and-so newspaper, his profession, he's an article writer, he's a columnist, for example, or he's a reporter, he's a photographer, and then, his name. So this will actually clear the things like anything. Next one is, do not write a first sentence with yesterday or continues. Well, it's a simple thing because people are, story, news is up to the minute actually, of course you know that. Yesterday is no news. So when you start your news this way, yesterday, blah, 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 what kind of attention you can grab? Because people are not like, going to waste their time for something to know about, which has happened, let's say 12 or 15 hours before, up to the minute, attention is there. Next one, do not start a story with another more or once again. Another more or once again, these are like, transitions for the written mode actually, not for oral mode. And then we have some waste words. There's a long list of waste words. I call them waste words. They are very good words for written. For paper news writing, they can be very good, but they are not good for, this oral, newscasting, this oral mode actually for TV and radio. Let's very quickly visit like all these waste words. For example, in order, in the process, literally, actually, really, suddenly, gradually, finally, flatly, personally, officially, miraculously, local, nearby area, separate, a total of, then, the fact that, meanwhile, on a lighter note. These are such words which are good for your writing actually, but they're not good for speaking. Of course, the transitional effect is very good for written news. For spoken news, of course, the transitional step, of course, will be different one. Next one is, do not lose or fail to reach the viewers. Well, this is, of course, this is what your job is actually. This is what your aim is actually, that you are, of course, going to stay with, serve your listeners and viewers through the best possible ways in terms of the news. Now, let's move towards another important point which we, like, if you remember, we talked about, style of language actually, newspaper style, in other words, that what are the stylistical pitfalls. If you remember, we discussed once, stylistical pitfall. Exactly the same way, there are some broadcast style also. When, news is written, to be voiced out, news is written for the newscaster, and then through newscaster, the news is going to be heard by the listeners and the viewers. There are certain styles, which TV and radio news writer has to follow. Let's discuss, those styles. First of all is, spacing. When the TV, radio news writer, writes, he, of course, gives double spacing everywhere. Between the lines, spacing is going to be double, of course. And then comes abbreviations. Okay, one more point about spacing. Spacing is double. Number one, all the words are going to be uppercase, so that newscaster could read very easily those words from the screen, and then, of course, could, tell the listeners and the viewers. Spacing is double, number one. Number two, all the words are uppercase. Okay? And then comes, abbreviations. No abbreviations we are going to use, only those which are globally understood, which are, average-wise understood, by, the listeners and the viewers. For example, if abbreviation is, let's say UNO, everyone knows what is UNO. If abbreviation is, let's say US, people know what is US. FBI, for example, people know what is FBI. Or if you're using Mr., for example, so MR, of course, you can use. Miss or Mrs. MRS you can use. Ms. Doctor, for example, DR you can use. So these are acceptable abbreviations, which of course can... Now, excuse me, now here please do not confuse yourself what I mean by this style. This style is, the way this report will be written for the newscaster to read it, for you as listener and as viewer, okay? So spacing is point number 1, double spacing, all language sentences uppercase. Number 2, abbreviations, no abbreviations, right for the newscaster to read, only acceptable, which are, easily understood, of course. One more important thing, there are some abbreviations which are read as alphabets. For example, when I say FBI is one F and then B and I. So what we do actually, to give a hint to the newscaster to read this abbreviation as alphabet, what we do actually, we introduce hyphen inside, like F hyphen B hyphen I, FBI. There are some more, abbreviations which are not as alphabet, they are read as word actually. For example, NATO. Now, we do not write this way, N hyphen A hyphen T hyphen O. If we put this way, the newscaster is going to read the same way, N-A-T-O. But we want that he or she not, read it as N-A-T-O, rather read it full. So we'll remove all the hyphens and we put it as one word. So this is a hint actually. This is a clue for the newscaster to speak it as NATO. So this is important thing. Another very important area, that is phonetic spelling. Look, we use spellings, in a written expression. Spelling errors, big sin. Exactly the same way we use we pronounce words, and mispronunciation is again the great sin we have to avoid. What we do actually, when there are some difficult names, for example, there are some foreign names, there are some foreign words, for example, or there are some technical words, there is some jargon, for example, any difficult word, for example, what we do actually, news writer is going to write phonetic spellings also for that word. I mean, word will be there, then in bracket, he is going to write phonetic spellings. What are these phonetic spellings actually? These phonetic spellings are, phonetic sounds. Like if I take you back to your dictionaries, in dictionaries, how pages are arranged. You have keywords, right? The bold words. Next to every bold word, there are some symbols written. There are some symbols written, in brackets. Now, those symbols are actually phonetic, spellings. Like when, let's say, the word is, cat, C-A-N-T. This is, you go to dictionary, you find, of course, C-A-T. Now, C has K sound also, C has S sound also. For example, in cat, the C is K sound. C-I-T-E is not kite. C-I-T-E is sight. So it means, C, letter C can have two sounds, K also and S also, right? So dictionary is going to guide you that this C-A-T should be pronounced as sat or cat, and C-I-T-E should be pronounced as kite or sight. Dictionary will guide you, of course. How? Of course, they write phonetic spellings. So you read those phonetic spellings and you understand the pronunciation. Exactly the same way, news writer is going to write phonetic spellings with every difficult words or with every possible word which newscaster may mispronounce. By the way, very quickly, time is short, very quickly, the way like in English language, we have 26 alphabets, starting from A to Z. These are 26 alphabet. Exactly the same way, we have 44 symbols. 44 symbols which we use to spell out words phonetically. These, you can find these symbols in your handout. which I gave you for your dictionary use, like dictionary as a writer's tool. There I have like, given you this complete, list of course, these sounds. Now, very quickly, I would like to, read out these sounds for you, and then, of course, I'll move forward. Like, ABC is divided into vowels and consonants, exactly the same way these 44 symbols are also divided in vowels and consonants. Let's first discuss the sounds of consonants. On your screen, left hand side, I have written the symbols. Right hand side, there are some words in which, these symbols are used. For example, the first symbol or the first sound is P, as in pip, B as in bib, T as in ten, D as in den, K as in cat. Now, I'm, voicing these sounds for you so that you could like, listen to them again and again and could also learn these symbols and the sounds, okay? So that tomorrow when you like, need to spell out phonetically some words, you could, and also you could like, when you consult dictionaries, for example, from there also you could understand the real function of, these symbols. Let's go ahead. G as in get, and F as in fish, V as in van, Th as in thigh, Th as in thy, S as in set, Z as in zen, Sh as in ship, J as in leisure. Now, this sound, the way we write small z or z, is J as in leisure. The way in Urdu also we have, probably we call it, zal with three nukte, and we speak it ajdaha, or jala bari. So, this is exactly the same way. J as in leisure, H as in hen, and then Ch as in church, J as in judge, N as in man, N as in sing, L as in let, R as in ride, and W as in wet. These are consonant, phonetic symbols and their sounds. It's very fast. Let's move towards vowel sounds. I as in pit, A as in pet, A as in pat, O as in pot, E as in put, U as in put, E as in petter, and then comes E as in bean, as in burn, A as in barn, O as in born, U as in boon. These are sounds, these are the symbols. Learn them, and this is how news writers, for the newscasters, transcribe or spell out, difficult words so that, they could be properly pronounced. Let's move ahead. Comes punctuation. Of course, we do not use punctuation marks for the newscasters to read, except commas and full stops. Next is numbers. Rule is the same, like 1 to 11, we are going to write words, and more than 11, for example, we will be using digits, okay? But if a sentence starts from a digit, then of course we write word at the place of, those digits. Moving ahead, web news writing. Well, frankly speaking, since the time now is really, short, in our next class, I'll throw light on what is web news writing. I'll spend 5-10 minutes on it. Then, of course, we'll move towards our next topic. I hope you understood and you liked today's lecture. And with this, let's call it a day. Take care of yourself and each other. Bye-bye.